We know that some many thousand years ago that we discovered that we would benefit from being able to write things down. We discovered that once we'd written things down, that we were developing at the same time an ability to read what was written down. And so much of our civilization, so much of our culture is dependent on our ability to communicate what we know to a new generation. And so in our teaching, we have a big responsibility. And that responsibility is to make sure that our learners develop the skills to be able to access the huge amount of information that is available for them now. Clearly, learners will develop that in their mother tongue. And clearly, as language teachers, we want them to develop a similar competence in English. You will find, of course, that in your teaching in Chinese or another language that you have a particular approach. Also, you will find that when you're teaching reading in English, you will have a slightly different approach. So today we're going to look at teaching reading for young learners, and that will be focused on storytelling, and we'll also look at teaching reading for older learners, and that will focus pretty much on what we do with textbooks in the classroom. As part of engaging our learners with the story, we start by, if we want, by commenting on or eliciting what they know from previous stories. So you might start by saying, do you remember the story of the three little piggies? And they will go, yes, yes, I remember, la, la, la. And then you ask, what happened to them? Da, da, da. They tell you and you go, oh, and was there someone bad in that story? And they go, yes, and they tell you who that is. And then you go, okay, so today we're going to read a new story in which there is also someone bad. Yeah, so elicit the story, get them interested in what is happening with it. You can support that with visuals. So you might have, if you were telling the story of Little Red Riding Hood, for example, then you could have all the visuals, Little Red Riding Hood, the forest, the wolf, grandma, and so on. Not too much detail, but just some, so you can help them use those visuals to identify the characters, so they know what grandma is, but also use that for a prediction. So after they've seen all of that, you can ask them, what do you think is going to happen? Once you've done that, then you can go about setting the scene. And the scene can be a long time ago, deep in the forest, where the wolves were wild and there wasn't much sun, there lived a young girl. So you've set the scene. They've got the idea. And then you can introduce the characters, maybe by going back to the pictures and identifying the wolf, the grandma, the woodsman, and so on. And that's good. So you're getting there in terms of developing the whole idea of the story. You've got to the characters. What you can do after that, if you wish, is you can perhaps start a mime. So you can mime some of the things that happen in the story, and as you're miming it, maybe your learners can call out what they think is happening. So you've really got them engaged in the story. They know a reasonable amount about it at this point, but if you feel that they're not getting it, that it's problematic, what you can do is give them an outline of the story in their mother tongue, just so they've got some good idea of what's going to happen next. We as language teachers are very aware that we need our learners to learn words. However, we're also very aware that learning language is not just about knowing vocabulary. It's much more complicated than that. So When it comes to reading, we're thinking, okay, what words do they need to know so that they can more or less process the whole reading? We do not want to go, let me make sure I teach them every word, because that defeats the purpose of reading. Reading is meant to be a process whereby you make meaning and you develop your skill in making meaning. So at the start of the lesson, you've got your vocab, the key vocab that they need to learn, and you want to find ways that you can make that interesting and memorable. And so you're going to use visuals probably, or any one of the many different techniques that you have learned in previous inputs on how to teach vocabulary. But you want your learners to be aware of the key meaning of the words before you go into the reading proper. After that, given what they know already, you give them the opportunity to ask and answer with each other about the characters, about the story. So let them ask and answer, who is this, who is that, what's going to happen, etc., etc. And then, of course, you give them the opportunity to ask you. And then you, of course, model the kind of language that you want them to understand, you want them to process, you want them to know. If you're really good and you've got some time, you will give answers, they will copy your answers. Don't do that too much, but you want them to be aware that when you are giving them language, it's language that's useful for them. So at the end of all of this, they have done a reasonable amount of work getting ready for the reading, and of course, the next step is the reading. So while the teacher is reading, what the teacher does is very, very important. So we need that teacher to have a big voice, dramatic voice, gesture, mime, all sorts of things so that the character and the story comes to life. So the teacher, once again, is very, very important in what happens in the classroom. So when the teacher is doing that, then the learners at various points can do different things. They can, for example, listen and hold up cards for things as they hear them. That keeps them focused and gets them doing the sorts of things that young learners like to do. You can get them to listen and mime as they hear something. So they can do the miming, or they can do some sort of action. So when they hear of a word, particular type of word, then they can do an action to represent that. So that would be a really good thing to do. You can have all your pictures up somewhere, and as they hear a word in the story, they can point at the picture. And that's also very engaging. You could similarly have pictures and labels. So words on cards, and as they hear those words, they can attach them to the pictures that they hear. You could also have a little grid, so a little worksheet if you like, or put something on the board where there's who, so the characters, and what. And you can list the whats and they can tick them as they hear them. So a very interactive and engaging thing to do while the teacher is doing a wonderful job of reading the story. More things you can do during the story, and clearly there's many things you can do, and what you really want to do with these things is engage your learners in feeling the benefit, the joy, the interest in reading. And you know already that a really good teacher is full of questions. And then obviously later, as the students get more used to that process, they are full of questions. And so as you're reading, what you're doing is you're asking them questions about the story. What do you think of this one? What about that? What are they going to do you think? Good guy? as you're reading the story so that they're really engaged with the whole process. Other little thing you can do, of course, is give them pictures or words or lexis, if you like, so expressions or pictures, and as they listen to the story, then they put those in order. So they're really thinking about the meaning and they're getting a really good idea of the structure of the story. You can also, with those same pictures or same expressions, more importantly, classify them. So are these good things, bad things? Is this person being nice or being bad? You can ask all sorts of questions for how they classify the pictures or the lexis. And of course, if they're classifying the lexis correctly, then they're understanding the function of the language in the story. Other thing they can do, which I'm sure you're aware of, is repeat. So you can read a line and then they repeat it. You can read another line and then they repeat it. And of course you can be referencing the words on the screen as you do that, so they're building some of their reading skills. You don't have to do that for everything, but you can do it for part of it. Other thing you can do is when you're reading, you can get them to join in. Yeah, now clearly in storytelling, reading once is good. Reading 3, 4, 5 times is much better because of the familiarity, because of the reading skills that are developing in that. So you can read the story and let them join in. Once again, maybe you're showing the words as you're reading it and they join in the process. So that's really, really cool. The last thing you can do, which you've kind of done already but will continue to do, is especially in a first or second reading, you read a page and stop and ask the question, what's going to happen? So you're developing their skills in terms of prediction, which means, as you know, they're thinking about what has happened and what's going to happen, which means they're really engaged in the language and meaning of the story. The end of the story is the beginning of a lot of other things. And after the story, there is the opportunity to deepen the understanding, to review, to reflect, to gain so much more from what is, or hopefully is, an interesting tale. So the first thing you can do, or one of the things you can do, is give your learners a little list of who, and then did or said. And so they have a list of names. They have a couple of columns with did and said, or do and say, and then they have another column which is all the things that could be done or said. So you might have visited grandma, and then of course they find Little Red Riding Hood and they tick that box. So that's one thing they can do, which is really cool. Second thing they could do is draw a picture of the story. And for those of your learners who really like being artistic, tremendous opportunity to develop the story. And of course, it will mean that at a later date, you can take that picture and go, okay, use this picture and tell your partner the story. So that's really, really cool. Next thing you could do is you could get them to match words or lines with pictures in the story. Yeah, so you can give them a picture in the story, or you can give them words with the story, and they have to match them together. So that's a good way of reviewing their awareness of the lexis. Next thing they could do is have role plays. Yeah, so for example, you're Little Red Riding Hood, you're the wolf, meet one another, talk about your part in the story. Pretend you're Little Red Riding Hood, pretend you're the wolf. So that's really cool. Next thing they can do is they can retell that story from a different perspective. So for example, imagine you are the grandmother and your cousin comes to visit you. Yeah? tell your cousin about what happened in the story. Yeah, so that's really nice reworking of it. You know, you can pretend to be old while you're telling your cousin about how dramatic and terrible the story was. What you can also do is you can continue the story. So you say to the learners, "Ah, there are 2 more pages to the story. 2 more. What happens, do you think? What happens to the people in the story in the next 2 pages?" And allow them to work on that with one another, think about the interesting or creative possibilities there. What you can also do is give them the entire text with some of the words removed and let them use their knowledge and awareness of the story to infill those gaps. So that's really cool. You could also do something similar with a picture of the story or a picture of a character in the story. And their job is, of course, to think about what they know about the story and complete the picture of the story or the picture of the character. Probably a favorite for learners and parents is making a storybook. So learners will do wonderful things like draw pictures and write some text from the story, draw more pictures, draw more text. Really wonderful process. What you're really doing at that point is saying to some of the children, you too could also be a story writer. And, you know, great writers have got to start somewhere. So something like that, really wonderful to do. You can do perhaps a cooperation where one kid does the drawings and the other one writes the words. Yeah, could be really, really wonderful thing to do. Something that's very challenging and also very useful is to give your learners, give your kids all the language from the story, or maybe not all of it, but cut up. Yeah, and they've got to go through and sort the lines, like what's first, what's second. Very, very challenging thing to do, but also very useful. You could also give them some of the key sentences, and what they could do is order the words in the key sentences. So that's very cool. Other little thing you can do is, and it's fun, is you read the story and you make a mistake and you keep going and see if they can spot the mistake, which means they're listening very carefully. And you could make all sorts of mistakes, character names or actions, anything you wanted to, but that's lots of fun, I think. Next thing you can do is try looking at rewriting the story, rewriting it with a different ending, so that they can write, doesn't have to be the same length, but gives them an opportunity to think about character and to think about language that they can use in developing a new story with a new meaning. So that's very cool. Other thing you can get them to do is project work. And in project work, you give them a new topic. So perhaps in the story, you've thought about the wolf and you're thinking, yeah, okay, wolves are in this story, they're bad, but maybe there's more to be learned about wolves. So perhaps they can do some project work on that on the net, you know, the life of a wolf, where they live, what they do, all that sort of stuff, which is really neat. You can also do, depending on your time, some craft work. And that craft work could be something like doing scissor cuts of characters in the story or making a little house or some such. But what we've got here is just, I think, a really good awareness that storytelling is great for young learners. And when you're doing that storytelling, remember that there's a lot you can do with it that will develop interest in reading, interest in language, and also develop more of that creative impulse, which is so valuable in learning. Just imagine saying to your students, open your books on page 22, read the text and answer the questions. an easy life for the teacher, but a sad life for the learners. Question is why? Why does that not work? Why is that not a good thing to do? Well, we know. We know that if you said to your family at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, come on, we're going, and they went, what? And you said, yeah, we're going, and they went, but why? Where? What are we doing? They would be confused. You would be confused. Altogether, you'd get an element of uncertainty which would not help the process of having a good experience for the day. And with reading, if you just jump in to a reading and then answer the questions, you bring so little in terms of planning, you bring so little in terms of awareness that your ability to gain meaning from the text is really low. And this is why good teachers, when they're teaching, they make sure that the students' knowledge, that their language, that their skills in relation to reading are activated before they start the task. They want their learners to be motivated, they want their interest to be focused, and so they give them interesting tasks before they get to the reading. And of course, some of the typical ones are look at the pictures, yeah, talk about the pictures, what do they have in common, for example. Look at these questions, look at these titles, and see what you can consider to be a potential story that we will be looking at. What is it going to be about, do you think? And of course, when you ask that question or those questions, you're activating their knowledge, you're activating their lexis, and you're getting them ready to read. Without that readiness, when they are reading, there's a lot of vocabulary in their heads that is still asleep. There's a lot of knowledge in their heads that is still asleep. And because it's asleep, it makes it difficult to understand the content and process the meaning in the text. Clearly, if you don't know the significant vocabulary in a text that you're reading, it's going to be difficult to process that text. It's going to be difficult to get the meaning. And that's why, as teachers, we make a point of developing our students' vocabulary. We do that lots and lots of different ways, and you've seen that throughout this course. Everything from the vocabulary question list to many other instances where we look at how you help learners develop meaning in language. So before a reading, you need to select the words that you think the students need to know in order to answer the questions or in order to complete the task. So assuming you have identified them, and identifying them means deciding that some words are not to be taught. They don't need them. You don't want to turn reading into a vocabulary learning task. Yeah, you want to turn reading into a task in which they are developing reading skills, they're developing an ability to gain knowledge from a text or generate ideas based on a text. So you go ahead from that point and you go, okay, I've got my vocabulary. Then the question is, how do you do it? There's lots of ways you can do it. You could use just the VQL, the vocabulary question list, and a list of words. You could do that. You could have a list of words and definitions or words and synonyms, many other examples. Or alternatively, you can put the words that you want them to check in a sentence, make sure the context is rich, so the context helps with the meaning, and then of course you can give them definitions. They can use the context in the sentence to help them figure out the meaning of the word and of course match that with the definition. In doing that, of course, you're helping them develop vocabulary awareness skills and raising their awareness for the vocabulary in the text. Once they've done that, of course, you need to check the answers. They've checked with one another, of course. You check the answers. And then when you've got the answers, remember to concept check them. And you know what that is already from previous inputs, but fundamentally in a concept checking question, you're identifying the key meaning and making sure the students know what the key meaning is. So for example, if the word was infamous, you could ask your students, does it mean well known? To which the answer is yes. And then you ask them the question, is this a good thing? Or is it a bad thing to be infamous? And then, of course, they say it's bad. And then you've concept checked the idea of infamy or infamous. So you concept check the language. They've worked on it with one another. They've done it in context. Don't forget to check the IPA or check the pronunciation. Because while pronunciation is not essential in reading, it does help them when it comes to discussing anything in the text which the lexis is important for. Imagine if reading was all about being able to answer this kind of question. The train leaves at ... Yeah, and then our students, our learners, look through the text and they find the phrase, the train leaves at ... and they see 11 o'clock and they go, yeah, I've got it. And you can feel good and they can feel good because they've got an answer. And certainly that scanning for information for something you already know about, if you like, you know you want to find the time the train leaves, then simple question like that is good and the answer is also simple. But most reading is much, much more than that. You are reading for ideas. You're reading for things that are a lot more complicated than the train leaves at 11 o'clock. And in order to understand the parts of what you're reading, you need to understand the overall picture, because it's the overall picture that creates the context within which the items of information have meaning. So what you do as a teacher is you ask overall comprehension or gist questions so that the learners read through the text reasonably quickly to generate the big picture of what the text is about. Now, those questions are typically things like, what is the text about? Yeah. It's a very good one. It's a very good one. So you read it in order to be able to generate that picture, in order to generate a short summary statement of what the text is about. And of course, a good teacher makes very sure that all the learners know what the meaning of the question is. Yeah, and so a question like what is the text about, you would say to the learners, okay, tell your partner another way to ask that question. Yeah, or if the task was, if the gist question was, is the hero successful? Yeah, then you would say to your learners, tell your partners another way to ask that question, and then they read the story in order to determine if the hero is successful or not. So we'll remember that when we start a lesson or reading lesson, in terms of the reading, we get our learners to answer gist questions, which are our overall idea questions, and that helps them determine the context within which the detail questions will have clearer meaning. Now, I wanted to look at this part of reading because sometimes it's a little bit uncertain for teachers. So when we give that question, which is what is the text about, for example, we don't know how much time to give our learners to do that. Sometimes also we tend to give our students the text the night before, to save some time in the classroom. And that's a little bit problematic because they're not really getting practice in what we want, which is the skill of skimming to generate meaning. What we want them to do with that is read through the text quite quickly. Now, what does quite quickly mean? Who knows? But it does mean that they're not reading word for word, or they're not double checking, they're not doing double takes. Basically, they're moving through the text quite quickly to generate overall meaning. Now, if they do it too quickly, they're not getting enough from the text. Yeah, the first reading should be enough for them to generate meaning and also locate parts of the text that will help them in that location, knowing where the answers are for other questions. So how quick should it be? That's a little bit up to you, but really it should be a lot quicker than the reading that goes in for detail. Now, there's lots of ways you can make it quicker. You can set a time limit. Yeah, you can ask them, which is kind of what I prefer. You say to them, okay, this has got 150 words. How much time do you think it will take you to read it? And you get them to look at it briefly and then make a prediction. Very useful. They know that they're going to do a general comprehension reading. Very useful for them to be able to know how long it will take them to do that, especially if you're looking at something like planning for study or working in an exam. So you set them a task which is to read it reasonably quickly. You can give them a time or negotiate a time. Sometimes that just doesn't work. Yeah, and the reason it may not work is that the text is too hard, and of course if it's too hard you need to get a different text. But what you can do is get them to raise their speed with one another. So get them to swap fingers, if you like. So one person owns the finger and the other person owns the eyes, and the person with the finger moves their finger reasonably quickly along the text, a little bit like the technique you use when you're developing speed reading. Yeah, so they move their finger quickly along the text, reasonably quickly. Their partner has to follow that speed, and then at the end they need to generate their answer. Of course they can swap and do that, but as I say, the reason that I'm mentioning this part of the reading is sometimes there's a little bit of confusion about how fast it is. Number one, not too fast. I've seen teachers sometimes go, okay, it's 150 words, you have 1 minute. And I'm going, oh, who can do that? Make sure that the text reading is reasonably fast, but also make sure it's not too fast. And if needs be, use partner control of fingers to build that speed. Probably one of the most useful tasks you can set in any class is to ask your learners to compare their answers. Bear in mind that this can also be a very empty task. If it's compare your answers and they just look at one another's answer, that really doesn't do very much except cost you some class time. But you know already that you're not going to do that. You're going to do things like compare your answers, tell your partner why you chose them. Yeah. Ask your partner how you know that. Now, why do you do that? You know already that in a classroom you're looking for acquisition of language, and we know that interaction is the matrix within which language acquisition takes place. In other words, learners need to use language with one another in order to acquire it. And one of the easiest ways to do that in the classroom is to have your learners discuss their answers. And then you give them time to think about it. What you will do, of course, is you will wander around, you will monitor. You will see how the discussion is going. Is one student looking like they're struggling, to see if you can help with that. And of course, once you've done that, you go back to the front or the side or the back or wherever you want to go, and then you ask for answers. And of course, at that point, all the learners have already discussed their answers. They've already developed some fluency in relation to their answers. And then when you're back at the front and you say to them, what did you get for number 7? And then they give you the answer. You can also ask, how do you know? And at that point, you're getting better answers from more informed learners. It is often said that we learn more from getting something wrong than we learn from getting something right. And at this point in the lesson, you have asked your learner, what's the answer? How do you know? And then you have heard that answer from them. What do you do then? What is the useful thing for those learners who perhaps got it wrong? And the most useful thing, of course, is either to get that learner to come up to the front, to point to the text and identify in detail why they think it is right and how they know and so on. More importantly is, after they've done that, for you to demonstrate, to model for your learners what your thought process was, not what the answer was, what your thought process was when you got to the same answer. You can talk around it. You can say, I thought it could have been this, but then I decided it was this because of la la la. And you can reference a number of things in the text. So when you're doing feedback on the answers, it is certainly not about just going, this answer's right, this answer's wrong. It's about understanding why the answer is right or wrong and modeling on your part the thought process that allowed you to get to that conclusion. This part of the reading lesson should take much longer than it normally does. What normally happens is the teacher will say, answer questions 1 to 6. Yeah, and that's it. The problem with that instruction, as you know, is that we don't know if the students have understood the question. And of course, if they haven't understood the question and then they get the wrong answer, we don't know the source of the problem. Is the source of the problem the fact that they didn't know the question, or maybe they did know the question, but they had wrong understanding in the reading? So it's very important at this part of the lesson that the students process in detail what the detailed questions are. So within that, you want to allow a good amount of time for the learners to look at the questions with one another and rephrase them. So what's another way to ask that? What's another word for this? What's an opposite for that? And at the end of that, of course, hopefully they have understood the questions, but they've also activated a lot more vocabulary that could be useful in decoding the meaning in the text. Of course, after they have done that, and after you have monitored while they're doing that, you can check with the class. So, number 3, what's another way to ask that question? Good. And does that mean da da da? Or does it mean da da da? Okay, good. Now let's check number 5, because you have found that 3 and 5 are difficult. So in short, in this part of the lesson, don't just say answer the questions. Make sure that your learners have processed the meaning sufficiently so that when they read the text, they are reading for the right question and hopefully the right answer. Our learners are working hard on answering detailed comprehension questions, and what you're doing is you're walking around the class monitoring as they are working on their questions. You're monitoring to see if you can help someone who's really struggling, and you're monitoring to see what the general completion is like. If your learners are struggling, then you will give them more time. Simple as that. There's no benefit at all in forcing people to read things quickly. Really, in exams, the amount of reading that you have to do looks a lot, but it's actually medium-paced reading. You don't need to read quickly, except for when you're doing gist-related tasks. So you walk around, you're monitoring. You know that they could be answering a whole range of questions. It could be questions as simple as, when did this happen? Yeah, or tricky time-related questions like, which happened first, this or this? Or other questions like, the word that in line 16 means what? Yeah, and then they have to look through the text and find out what that means. Or they could be a question like, why did the author say la 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 la? Or what is the author's overall opinion on la la la? So it could be many. So when they're reading for detail, bear in mind that you are being very active. It's not time for a holiday. You walk around the class, you monitor as your learners work on developing their reading skills. Of course, you know what happens next, and you also know why. So the learners will compare their answers. You will allow more time for this because the answer comparison is more detailed, more difficult to explain it. And then, of course, you as the teacher will ask for the answers, and then you will do detailed feedback. Your focus will be on why answers are right or wrong with reference to the text. And you'll follow the process, which is you will ask them what answer have they got. If you get an answer that's almost good enough or almost correct, you might say to the rest of the class, can anyone else add to that, or would anyone else like to add to that? But you come up with the right answers in the end, and your primary objective at this point is to use the answers as a way of developing reading skills. So the answer is X. Where is it in the text? How do we know it's the right answer? What are the words that support it? What are the references in the text that support it? So this part of the reading is the most important because your learners have looked through the general understanding. They have been very clear on the meaning of the questions. They've got good overall idea, and they have delved very carefully into the meaning and the explanations of the meaning. At the end, you want to give them guidance on what you think is the reading strategy, the reading thought process that you went through to get the answer. And that's where you do your most important job in reading as the teacher. We know when we get to the end of a reading, there is a temptation to just put it away and go, finished, let's move on to something else. But this really reduces the opportunity we've got to develop our learners as language learners. We know that learners who interact in language, learners who are motivated to learn language, they become better language learners. Yeah, it's not that they have learned more, they become better language learners. So at the end of a reading, we need to give value to that reading, and we need to give communicative value to that reading. So the learners have read it, then we want to make it personal and meaningful. So we give them an opportunity to interact with that text, if you like. So it could be a question as simple as tell your partner or your group whether you liked or disliked the text and why. It could be something like retell the story or the text, rewrite it so that it expresses a slightly different meaning. Be a journalist, interview a character in the text. There could be many, many things that you can do with that text. Write a summary of it. And as I've mentioned already, explain why you agree or disagree with it. So there are many, many things you can do with the reading once it's done. And of course, after you've done with a reaction to or response to the text, then you can move on to digging into the detail of the lexis. When we began the input today on reading, we looked at generating motivation for our learners, and then comprehension questions, and then we looked at lexis. Now, the irony is the end of the lesson is probably the best place to look at lexis. And at this point, it is the best place because the learners have already experienced all the language in context. They have got the general meaning, they've got the detail meaning, they've explored a lot. And now is the chance for them to drill a little bit more, to discover more about the meaning of words. And that's something that they can do very easily with the application of the VQL. So just use the vocabulary question list for, synonyms, antonyms, what's another way to say that? This is a noun form. Does it have a verb form? Can you find a prefix, etc., etc. Really, really useful thing to do there. And of course, that is all learner driven. So the students choose that. If you like, and they can also choose for one another a little gap fill. So perhaps they can cut out parts of the text and their partners have to try and discover what words go in there, or you could do that and then just display that on a screen so that they could work on that. So that's really, really cool. You could also do some interesting memorization tasks where they could choose part of the text that they found something that was interesting, yeah, and they can memorize that. Hopefully it's interesting in terms of meaning and language. And then of course a favorite task, because it's so good, is a translate and retranslate task. So you could give them part of the text, just a few sentences really. They translate that into Chinese. You keep those translations, and after a few weeks, you say to them, okay, here's your Chinese back. Please translate that back into English. And of course, once they've translated it back into English, you look at the original text and they get to identify the differences, which are their weak points in terms of acquiring accurate language. So that's it really in terms of our input on reading. There's a lot more that you can learn about reading, but I figure that what we've been through today are some very useful techniques for you as a teacher when you are teaching reading. I hope you've enjoyed it. I have, and I'll see you next time.